So, I did a video a couple days ago that I called the Dis-Ontological argument against Christianity. And unfortunately, I was in the car at the time, and the audio quality wasn't very good. So, this is attempt number 2 at laying out that argument and explaining why I think Christianity is not true and might be bad as well as not true. So, to begin with, I think it would make sense to start with the arguments that people give for being a Christian in the first place. And there are 3 main arguments that people give. I'll deal with the first 2 before bringing up the third one, because that's the relevant one. And the first argument is an argument from personal experience that people give. They'll say, well, I actually saw a God, or I met him. He came to me and spoke to me. There's really not much else that needs to be said. That's one common argument you might hear. And another one that's interesting and relevant is a sort of historical argument where people will say, well, there's very strong evidence that Jesus Christ was a real person, that he was crucified in 34 AD or whatever, and that there's multiple corroborating accounts of an empty tomb, so his resurrection from the dead makes the most sense of the historical data we have, therefore Christianity is true. So those are the two of the 3 big arguments. Now, this in reverse order, the second one I don't think is very persuasive to most people. I think it's an ex post facto rationalization and justification for coming to the faith in some other way. And the reason for this is that the historical evidence is just not that compelling. The strongest piece of evidence that Christians flaunted for decades was the Shroud of Turin. But the more we learn about that, the more fraudulent it looks to be. It was probably created sometime in the 13th or 14th century, which is about the time that the first accounts of it show up, and that's the time where the most accurate scientific dating places its origin. Not the first century. But that's just one piece of evidence. The data regarding the eyewitness accounts at the time of Jesus' death they're ambiguous, and there's a lot of possible explanations that Christians will dismiss as, well, that's absurd. No one would rob the tomb of the grave because that just wouldn't make any sense. And they dismiss a fair number of alternative possibilities as less plausible than a dead person rising from the grave. And that resurrection meaning something theologically significant. I leave it to you to determine which of those 2 possibilities, and there are many, many different possibilities, is more objectively plausible. But I have yet to hear more than 1 or 2 cases of someone actually being persuaded by the historical account. And most of the people who claim to have been persuaded by the historical account are, they're not lying, but they are confabulating to some degree. I think Lee Strobel falls into this category. But anyways, that's enough about the historical account, I think, for now. This isn't about that, really. Regarding the personal account, personal experience of meeting a god or a spirit or an angel. And I say a god or a spirit or an angel, a god rather than the god, because people from all around the world, in all sorts of different religious contexts, describe meeting God. I have a good personal friend, actually, who has met, and I believe him when he says this, says he has met both Jesus and Odin. Now, what do you make of something like that? It's a little bit tricky because belief in Christianity necessarily holds that all other gods are false gods, probably don't even exist. And how would the Christian who claims to have met Jesus deal with the claims that people have met Krishna, or the Buddha, or Odin, or Allah, or any number of other gods and spirits that people claim to have met a personal experience? Their theology precludes those claims from being true, or at least from being properly understood. That person didn't meet that God. Instead, what they met was, a demon, or God in disguise, or something other than what they think they've seen. Which naturally puts the Christian in the awkward position of being open to the same criticism. How do you know that the thing that you met or experienced was an encounter with Jesus Christ? You don't. All of these supernatural encounters are subject to interpretation. And two people who have identical experiences in the actual facts may interpret them in wildly different ways based upon the religion of their upbringing, which sort of throws the objective truth of the claim of the truth of the religion in question it throws it into doubt. So, what do we make of these personal experiences? Well, I don't doubt that they are profound experiences and may even reveal something true. But you can't necessarily deduce the truth of a religion based on a perceived encounter with one of the divinities in question, or else an exclusive religion like Christianity opens itself up to other religions being true because one of their adherents has similarly encountered their divinities. And so that's a quick overview of those two kinds of arguments and why I don't find them particularly compelling. But there's a third argument, and this is the main one I want to focus on here. And that is the philosophical and rational arguments for the existence of the Christian God. Now, there are a number of these. There's the teleological argument, which says that, you look around you and you see the beauty of the natural world, and more importantly, the order, the seemingly visible intentionality of these things. And you say, well, these things clearly had to have been designed in this way. They must have been created, which implies a creator, ergo God. There is the cosmological argument. How can we have something other than nothing? It implies some creator, again, having created the universe rather than it just coming into being. And there's more sophisticated versions of this argument. I'm just giving the summaries of them. But in my opinion, the strongest argument for Christianity is what's called the ontological argument. And the ontological argument runs basically as follows. If you look around the world and you can see the existence of true evil, not just Nietzschean bad, but actual evil, so malice for its own sake, then it implies a continuum and an opposite of a transcendent good, and extremes on both of these fronts. A maximal possible bad. Sam Harris talks about this a little bit in The Moral Landscape, with his particular notion of what the absolute bad might look like. And then there's a maximal possible conceivable good that exists too. And all the ontological argument does is it notes this continuum, and it says, well, by definition, God is that which is the maximally conceivable good that exists. And we'll call that God. It's a fairly compelling argument, and it's actually persuaded a fair number of people. particularly people who've experienced real suffering in their life. And they say, I'm going to set my eyes on the good, and that good is God. And this is where the dis-ontological argument against Christianity comes from. And I want to point out that what I'm about to say might disprove Christianity, even if you don't find the ontological argument to be the most personally compelling account of God. Maybe you're persuaded by the historical account, or maybe you met Jesus, or maybe you find one of the other arguments more compelling. But the dis-ontological argument would still be a strong criticism, because it addresses aspects of God which are necessary to the Christian theology. If God is not morally perfect, if he is not the standard of goodness itself, then Christianity falls apart. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's saying that I am the law. He is saying that he is the standard of good and the giver of good. So, if God is not morally perfect, then Christianity is not true. And, atheists sort of put their finger on this in their, constant attempts to find contradictions in the Bible and stuff. And many of them are very petty, like, how many horses did King Solomon have in his stable? And there's a couple different accounts of that. How many disciples were at this place at this time? That's not really that relevant, I don't think. But when you get into moral precepts that are grounded in the necessary theology of faith, you run into trouble. Now, the important point about the ontological position is that it's based on moral intuitions. It's based on our perception of something being good or bad in some objective sense. And then saying, well, based on my perception, this is evil rather than just bad. Based on my perception, this is good. And so if our moral intuitions come into question at any point down this road, then the basis for the ontological argument also comes into question, because if our moral intuitions cannot be trusted, then our belief in the objective moral good and objective moral evil that we see in the world would also fall into question. So, the biggest thing for me when I look through the Bible that challenges my moral intuitions is when the Bible talks about family. Now, this might sound a little strange. The red-tailed hawk. Because most people think that Christianity is pro-family. Most people think that Christianity is very much supportive of the nuclear family and traditional family values and so forth. I don't believe that's true. And there are a few Bible verses that I think prove me to be correct on this. The first one that comes to mind, Jesus tells his disciples in one verse, he says, if you do not hate your father and your mother, yea, and even your own life, you cannot be my disciple. And in another verse, he says that I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, to set father against son, brother against brother, daughter against mother-in-law, etc. Now, these might sound like curious verses that might have some other meaning and context. Maybe he's just being, metaphorical. Maybe he's saying you must hate your father relative to your love of God or something like that. I still think that's a bad metaphor. I still think you shouldn't hate your father, especially juxtaposed with the commandment to love one's enemies. I view that to be more immoral, but morally counterintuitive at the very least. Even secular moralists cite Jesus as a radical moral teacher for the doctrine of loving one's enemies. That's not normal. It's morally counterintuitive. Remember what I said before about the ontological argument being based on moral intuitions. So, we're supposed to, and I should go into the theology of why I take these doctrines at face value about hating one's family and loving one's enemies. The Christian worldview holds nothing to be worthy of love and worship except God. No one is worthy of, and if you get into the etymology of worship, it really comes from worthship, the quality of having worth, to pay attention to something, to love something, to write songs about something, etc. And they say God is so great, God is so magnificent and perfect in his love, that everything else is weak and pathetic and horrible by comparison. So you could say, okay, maybe I'm not supposed to hate my family literally, but to acknowledge that they are not worthy of love relative to God. But there's an out, they say. We are to love our family in the way that God loves the church. You're correct. Our expressions of love for our family are mirrors of our love for God. But the problem is that this isn't limited to the family exclusively. It applies to all people, because our family is worthy of love because they are image bearers of God. Imago Dei is the theological term. As image bearers of God, we are worthy of love as stand-ins for others' love of God. So when I love my wife, I don't love my wife. I love God through my wife. Now, I think that's sort of twisted on its face. When I talk about loving my wife, I don't love God and she's just the nearest thing to express that love for God to. I love her for her. I love my daughter for her own sake, not for the love of some deity commanding me to do that. And there's no differentiation theologically between loving one's family and loving all other humans who are equal with each other as image bearers of God. So there's no basis to distinguish between stranger and friend, family and someone else. And Christians can find some verses that will say, if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than the unbeliever. And back to the atheist comment, okay, well, it appears we have a contradiction. Hi, Dash. And so when you have these two different possible interpretations, go back to the theology. What does the theology make to be more likely? Well, given the Imago Dei doctrine, which is necessary as a part of the church, it seems clear that Jesus was the more serious one when he said, or Jesus' position that we should, relatively speaking, love our enemies and hate our family is the more theologically relevant takeaway. We love our families and we take care of our families as duties, to demonstrate the glory of God. But it has nothing to do with loving our families more than anyone else. It's just a matter of setting a good example. The sounds of nature. And so, I guess to conclude, the anti-differentiation between family and stranger, and the putting of everyone on an equal pedestal as equal in their godliness, as equal possessors of the spark of the divine relative to the actor, relative to the believer. I find Christianity and Christian theology to be too morally perverse, too morally counterintuitive to be believable. And again, if Christianity is telling us to do something that we find to be morally wrong, morally bad, then it begs the question, how can we believe in a morally perfect God based on our observations of objective moral good and evil in the world in the first place? The whole thing falls apart, and the basis for belief in God in the first place from the ontological argument fades away. And even if your belief in God wasn't founded on the ontological argument specifically, those qualities are still necessary components of God's nature. And so even if you believe in the historical God, the ontologically perfect God cannot be the Christian God, because his morality is not our own. His ways are not ours. And he is not moral. And so he does not exist.